You were taught to hold it together, to show the world a clean, confident version of yourself, and keep the messy, uncertain parts hidden somewhere no one could find them. You learned that admitting struggle was weakness, that showing emotion was losing control, that being open about your fears, your failures, your real opinions was an invitation for people to use them against you. And so you built the armor, layer by layer, conversation by conversation, year by year. And behind that armor, you became someone slightly less real than you actually are. And the strange, cruel irony is that the armor you built to protect you became the thing that isolated you. The very thing you hid was the thing that would have connected you. This audiobook is about what happens when you stop hiding. Not recklessly, not without wisdom or discernment, but honestly, radically, carefully, courageously, honest. Every chapter will go deeper into what vulnerability actually is, why the culture around you trained you out of it, and why the people who have learned to practice it are not weaker for doing so. They are more connected, more trusted, more creative, more resilient, and more genuinely powerful than the armored versions of themselves ever were. The research is clear. The experience of people who have crossed this threshold is consistent. Vulnerability is not the opposite of strength. It is how strength is built. If you are enjoying this audiobook and want to continue building real communication confidence, subscribe to this channel now. More chapters are coming, and each one will guide you step by step through mastering every conversation. Chapter 1: The Lie That Armor Protects You. Somewhere along the way, someone convinced you that keeping your inner world locked was safety. Maybe it was a parent who equated tears with weakness. Maybe it was a school environment where being different made you a target. Maybe it was a relationship where opening up once produced enough pain that the lesson felt permanent. Whatever the source, the conclusion arrived early and settled deep. Show less of yourself, and the world cannot hurt you. The armor was a rational response to real conditions. It made sense when it was built. The problem is not where it came from. The problem is what it costs to wear it for decades, and what happens to the person inside it over time. The armor costs more than most people have ever fully calculated. It costs authentic connection, because genuine connection requires two real people, and armor turns one of them into a performance. It costs creative range, because creativity requires risk and uncertainty, and the willingness to produce something imperfect and exposing, all of which armor is specifically designed to prevent. It costs the trust of others in ways that are invisible to the person wearing it, because people sense inauthenticity even when they cannot name it, and they pull back slightly from the version of you that is managed rather than real. The armor costs your own access to yourself, because after years of performing the protected version, many people genuinely lose touch with who they actually are underneath the presentation. Brené Brown spent over 2 decades studying vulnerability, shame, and what she called wholehearted living. Her research produced a finding so consistent across thousands of interviews that it could not be explained away. The people who reported the most meaningful connection, the deepest sense of purpose, the most genuine belonging, were not the people who had managed to avoid vulnerability. They were the people who had walked directly into it with something she called courage. Not recklessness, not oversharing. Courage. the willingness to show up and be seen when there was no guarantee of the outcome. The armor, her data showed, did not produce the safety it promised. It produced a specific kind of loneliness that people rarely named accurately, because naming it would require admitting they were lonely inside a life that looked fine from the outside. The physiology of armor is worth understanding because it reveals costs that go beyond the psychological. Maintaining a defended emotional presentation requires sustained muscular tension, altered breathing patterns, and continuous activation of the stress monitoring systems in the nervous system. Research on emotional suppression consistently shows that the effort of not showing an emotion does not eliminate the physiological arousal that emotion produces. The heart rate elevation from embarrassment or grief or fear is not reduced by the effort to appear calm. It is, in some studies, actually increased by the additional work of suppression. The person who looks composed at the surface is burning energy at depth. The armor is not inert protective covering. It is an active, metabolically expensive performance happening every moment it is worn. There is a specific quality of exhaustion that comes from sustained performance rather than from sustained effort. The effort of building something, training something, creating something can be genuinely tiring but leaves the person feeling used rather than depleted. The exhaustion of performing the managed version of yourself leaves a different residue. It is the exhaustion of a person who spent the day being someone slightly different from who they are, and who returns home to themselves, if they can find themselves, drained in a way that sleep alone does not fully address. People who live behind significant armor frequently report a low-grade weariness that does not track with their level of activity, because the activity was not the drain. The performance was. The specific lie the armor tells is that it is making you safe when it is actually making you alone. Safety and aloneness are easy to confuse when you are inside the armor because both feel like nothing is reaching you. But there is a critical difference between nothing reaching you because you are protected and nothing reaching you because you are isolated. The person in a room with glass walls can see out and others can see in. The person in a sealed box cannot be touched, but they cannot be reached either. The armor is the sealed box. And the people outside it are real people who wanted genuine contact, but kept finding the surface of the box instead of the person inside it. Walking away from armor does not mean dismantling it all at once. That is not courage. That is collapse. The distinction between radical honesty and reckless disclosure is one of the most important in this entire book, and it will be returned to in multiple forms in the chapters ahead. Radical honesty is not the project of telling everyone everything all the time. It is the project of being genuinely present and real in the conversations that matter, of bringing your actual self rather than your managed self to the relationships that deserve it, and of learning to discern which situations call for openness and which do not require it. The goal is not to tear down all walls. It is to know where the doors are and to stop being afraid to use them. The invitation of this chapter is simply to begin an honest accounting of what your armor costs you, not what it protects you from. That list is familiar and already rehearsed. But what it costs, what conversations have not happened because the armor was there, what depth of connection has not been reached because the armor kept the surface encounter as the only encounter. What creative risks have not been taken? Because the armor required all work to be defensible before it could be shown. What version of yourself has been sitting quietly behind the protection, waiting for the conditions that feel safe enough to come out? That accounting is the beginning of understanding why vulnerability, practiced with wisdom and intention, is not a sacrifice of protection. It is a recovery of self. Chapter 2. What vulnerability actually is. The word vulnerability has an image problem. It summons a picture of a person crying in public, confessing something private to someone they barely know, or collapsing under pressure in a way that leaves them exposed to judgment or exploitation. This image is not what the word actually means, and the distance between the image and the reality is one of the primary reasons people reject the practice before they ever genuinely try it. Vulnerability, in its truest sense, is not the performance of emotion for an audience. It is not weakness packaged in the language of openness. It is the willingness to engage in a situation or conversation or creative act without being able to guarantee the outcome. It is showing up without armor, in contexts where the outcome genuinely matters and cannot be controlled. Psychologists distinguish between state vulnerability and trait vulnerability in ways that clarify the practical meaning considerably. State vulnerability is the experience of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure in specific situations. Everyone experiences it when proposing a big idea, when telling someone they love them first, when sharing work they care about with someone whose opinion matters, when disagreeing with authority in a room full of people who might judge the disagreement. Trait of vulnerability is not something a person is more or less of permanently. It is a practice, a relationship to the state of uncertainty, rather than an innate characteristic. The person who practices vulnerability has not become someone who feels less uncertain. They have become someone who has learned to keep moving while uncertainty is present. The distinction between vulnerability and oversharing is essential and worth staying with carefully. Oversharing is the use of personal disclosure for purposes that serve the discloser rather than the relationship or the moment. It is the person who unloads extensive personal history on a stranger before trust has been established. It is the use of emotional disclosure as performance, as a way of appearing open without being genuinely open, as a bid for sympathy that is not the same as a bid for connection. Genuine vulnerability has a quality of appropriateness to it. It emerges in response to a real situation, is offered to a person or context where it genuinely belongs, and serves the relationship rather than just the need of the person disclosing. This distinction will be explored in much more detail in the chapter on discernment. Vulnerability requires what researchers call uncertainty tolerance, the capacity to remain functional and engaged in the presence of ambiguous outcomes. Research on uncertainty tolerance shows that it varies significantly between individuals and that it can be developed through graduated exposure to uncertain outcomes, very much like the exposure therapy described in other contexts. The person who can only take action when the outcome is guaranteed will take very little action in a world where almost nothing is guaranteed. The person who can move toward something meaningful while holding the uncertainty of how it will be received has a range of motion that the certainty seeker simply does not have. Vulnerability is the practice of expanding that range, There is a quality to genuine vulnerability that is recognizable in the moment it is encountered, even by people who have not studied the concept. It is the quality of realness. The conversation that had been pleasant but surface suddenly becomes real when one person says something true and uncertain. The meeting where performance was the expectation becomes real when someone names a difficulty they are actually having. The relationship that was warm but distant becomes real when someone says what they actually think rather than what is expected. The quality of realness is not about the content disclosed. It is about the presence of the person disclosing it. Real presence in a conversation where real presence was not required is the simplest possible description of what vulnerability looks like in practice. Many people confuse vulnerability with weakness because they observe others being vulnerable at moments of genuine difficulty, during grief, during failure, during loss, and interpret the openness as caused by the weakness of the situation rather than as a choice made within it. But the same quality of openness that appears in difficult moments is available in moments of strength, excitement, pride, and joy. Sharing something you are genuinely excited about, knowing it might not land. Telling someone what they mean to you before you know what you mean to them. Expressing an opinion you are not certain others will share. These are acts of vulnerability that occur in contexts of strength and enthusiasm. The connection between vulnerability and weakness is a misreading of where vulnerability appears, not an accurate description of what it is. The courage element of vulnerability deserves its own examination because it is the part that most people have been told they need, but few have been taught how to develop. Courage, in the context of vulnerability, is not the absence of fear about how openness will be received. It is not the certainty that the outcome will be good. It is the decision to proceed in the direction of genuine engagement, despite the fear and despite the uncertainty. Research on courage consistently shows that people who act courageously do not feel fearless before acting. They feel the fear and act anyway. And the acting changes something in the fear over time. Not eliminating it, but changing its role from obstacle to signal. The fear becomes a reliable indicator that something genuinely matters rather than a reliable reason to stop. Understanding what vulnerability actually is changes the question from whether to be vulnerable to how to practice vulnerability in a way that is wise, well-timed, appropriately expressed, and given to context and people that deserve it. That question is far more interesting and far more workable than the binary of hiding everything or exposing everything that the culture around vulnerability tends to present. The practice is sophisticated. It is calibrated. It develops over time. And the person who is developing it is not becoming less protected than they were. They are becoming more selectively open in ways that produce genuine connection, creative courage, and a quality of presence that the armored version of themselves never could. Chapter 3. The Science of Radical Honesty. In 1997, psychologist James Pennebaker published findings from a series of studies that challenged assumptions about emotional disclosure that had stood for decades. He had participants write for 15 to 20 minutes on 4 consecutive days about the most traumatic or emotionally significant experience of their lives, while a control group wrote about neutral topics. The results were striking. The people who wrote about their most significant emotional experiences showed measurable improvements in immune function, visited doctors less frequently, reported better psychological well-being, and in follow-up studies were more likely to find employment after job loss than the control group. The disclosure was not to another person. It was to a blank page. The honesty itself, separate from anyone receiving it, produced physiological and psychological changes that were difficult to explain through any mechanism other than the direct benefit of bringing what was inside to the outside. Pennebaker's work opened a field that has now produced hundreds of studies, examining the relationship between emotional disclosure and health outcomes across contexts ranging from clinical populations to corporate environments. The findings hold across cultures, across age groups, and across the specific form the disclosure takes, whether written, spoken, or even gestured. What the research consistently shows is that the act of processing and expressing genuine experience, as opposed to suppressing or avoiding it, has measurable positive effects on both physical and psychological health. The mechanism appears to involve several pathways simultaneously. Reduced cognitive load from no longer managing the suppression of the experience, better sleep as rumination decreases, improved immune regulation as stress hormones stabilize, and greater access to social support as the disclosure makes the need for support visible. The neuroscience of emotional disclosure reveals something particularly interesting about why honesty feels so different from performance. When a person expresses something that is genuinely true for them, the brain's reward circuits activate in ways that are similar to, though distinct from, the activation that occurs with other forms of reward. The experience has a specific quality, often described as relief, which reflects the relaxation of the suppression system that was maintaining the undisclosed state. The brain's default mode network, which handles autobiographical processing and self-reference, also appears to function differently after genuine disclosure, with better integration of the disclosed experience into the larger narrative of the self. The story gets told, and then it can be placed. Untold stories accumulate in a way that makes them harder to process and harder to move past. Research on trust formation in social and professional contexts adds another dimension to the science. Studies consistently show that self-disclosure by one party in a relationship increases trust and reciprocal disclosure by the other party, a phenomenon researchers call disclosure reciprocity. The person who shares something genuine creates a social environment in which the other person feels safer, doing the same. The trust that builds in this reciprocal dynamic is qualitatively different from the trust built through consistent behavior alone, because it has depth to it. It is not just the trust that someone will show up when they said they would. It is the trust that comes from knowing something real about a person, from having seen behind the managed surface, and from having that seeing be received without exploitation. The biology of the social connection that vulnerability produces is worth understanding in its own right. Researcher Matthew Lieberman's work on social pain and social reward demonstrated that the human brain processes social connection and social disconnection through many of the same neural circuits that process physical pain and physical reward. This means that genuine connection is not just emotionally satisfying in some abstract sense. It is neurologically rewarding in the same direct, concrete way that eating when hungry or resting when tired is rewarding. And social isolation, which sustained armor produces, is not just emotionally unpleasant. It is neurologically painful in a way that registers in the same systems that register physical injury. The armor that it appears to protect produces a form of chronic pain that most people cannot quite name. The research on creativity and psychological safety brings the science of honesty into the professional domain with practical urgency. Google's Project Aristotle, a large-scale internal research project studying what made teams high-performing across hundreds of teams in the company, identified psychological safety as the single most important factor. Psychological safety is the shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking, that members will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. The teams where people could be honest, including honest about not knowing, honest about making errors, honest about disagreement, consistently outperformed teams with equivalent or greater individual talent where that safety was absent. Honesty was not a nice cultural feature in those teams. It was the performance variable. The longitudinal research on relationship satisfaction adds a dimension that most people feel intuitively but rarely have framed scientifically. Studies following couples over many years consistently find that the couples who report the highest satisfaction over time are not the couples who reported the fewest conflicts or the most agreement. They are the couples who reported the most direct communication about difficult things, including conflicts, disagreements, and unmet needs, engaged with through an approach researchers call constructive dialogue rather than either avoidance or hostility. The willingness to be honest about difficulty, to surface what is actually happening, rather than maintain the peace at the cost of reality, predicted relationship satisfaction decades later better than many other variables. Radical honesty in close relationships is not a risk to the relationship. The sustained absence of it is. The science does not argue for undifferentiated honesty in all contexts, with all people, at all times. It argues for the value of honesty as a practice, for the measurable benefits of processing and expressing genuine experience, rather than perpetually managing and suppressing it, for the trust and connection and creativity that disclosure produces when it is offered appropriately. The context and the relationship always matter. But the baseline finding, replicated across decades and disciplines, is that the suppression of genuine experience costs more than the culture around you will ever tell you it costs. And the practice of honesty, at whatever level of courage is currently available, returns something that the suppression was taking. Chapter 4. Shame and the Wall It Builds. Shame is the primary emotion that makes vulnerability feel impossible. Not embarrassment, which is a brief and relatively mild social discomfort. Not guilt, which is the painful recognition of having done something wrong. Shame is the experience of believing, at a fundamental level, that you are wrong. Not that you made a mistake, but that you are one. Not that you have a problem, but that you are the problem. Shame does not say I did something bad. It says I am bad. And this distinction, which sounds subtle, is one of the most consequential. in the psychology of human behavior. Guilt produces the impulse to repair. Shame produces the impulse to hide. And the hidden self, the self that believes it must stay hidden to be accepted, is the self that cannot risk the exposure of genuine honesty. Researcher Brené Brown, in her work on shame, identified a quality she found consistent among people who had developed what she called shame resilience, the ability to move through shame experiences without being defined by them. That quality was connection, not the performance of connection, not the appearance of being well connected. Genuine human connection in which the person felt seen and accepted despite having been seen. Her finding was direct. Shame cannot survive being spoken about in the presence of compassion. The experience that felt unbearable in isolation lost its power to define when it was held by someone who received it without judgment. The shame needed secrecy to maintain its grip. Honesty, offered to the right person, was the thing that released the grip. The architecture of shame in the nervous system is worth understanding because it explains why vulnerability feels so physiologically difficult. Shame activates the threat response of the nervous system with an intensity comparable to physical threat. The desire to disappear, to become smaller, to exit the space or the conversation is a behavioral output of the threat response applied to a social context. The body is doing with shame what it does with physical danger, preparing to flee or to freeze. This means that the person who is ashamed and trying to be honest is fighting a physiological system, not just a psychological reluctance. The body is actively working against the disclosure because disclosure in the presence of shame feels like maximum exposure in maximum danger. Shame is culturally transmitted with efficiency that few other emotional experiences can match. The child who is shamed for showing fear, for making mistakes in front of others, for having needs that are inconvenient, for being different in ways the group does not accommodate, internalizes shame as a feature of those aspects of themselves. The shame says that the fear, the mistake, the need, the difference is the problem. The response to the shame is concealment. And the concealment becomes a habit. And the habit becomes an identity. And the identity of the person who does not show fear, who does not admit mistakes, who does not have needs that are inconvenient, who does not reveal the ways they are different, is the identity of the armored person described in the first chapter. Shame built the armor. Understanding shame is how you start understanding the armor. The distinction between shame and guilt has practical implications for how honesty is practiced. Guilt, properly experienced and expressed, is vulnerability without shame. To say I made a mistake and I am genuinely sorry for the harm it caused is an honest statement about behavior that does not require the person to condemn their own worth as a human being. It is honest, it is appropriately vulnerable, it connects to the other person's experience, and it opens the door for repair. Shame, by contrast, says I am a mistake, which forecloses repair and connection because the thing that needs to change is not a behavior, but the fundamental nature of the person. Learning to recognize when you are experiencing guilt, which is workable rather than shame, which requires a different kind of response, is a skill that genuine honesty development depends on. Perfectionists and shame are almost always found in close proximity because perfectionism is one of the primary coping strategies humans develop. for managing the shame of imperfection. If the work is perfect, it cannot be criticized. If the person is perfect, they cannot be found lacking. If nothing is ever released or attempted until it is good enough to be shame-proof, then the shame of public imperfection can be avoided. But the perfectionism is not managing shame. It is confirming it. Every refusal to release work, every postponement of an attempt, every retreat from the exposure of being genuinely seen is a vote for the shame story. It says the shame is right. The real thing, the imperfect actual self, is too much of a risk. Radical honesty, applied to the perfectionist, means releasing something real before the shame says it is safe to do so. Working with shame, rather than around it, requires developing the capacity to name it when it is happening. Research on affect labeling, the practice of identifying and naming emotional states, shows consistently that naming an emotion reduces its physiological intensity by engaging the prefrontal cortex in a way that partially modulates the amygdala's threat response. This sounds technical, but it is practically significant. The person who can notice and name, "I am feeling shame right now," as distinct from the engulfing experience of being shame without being able to observe it, has introduced a separation between the self and the state that makes the next action more available. The shame has not disappeared, but it has become something the person is experiencing rather than something the person is. The most important thing to know about shame and honesty is that they cannot coexist indefinitely. One will eventually win. Either the shame will successfully maintain the concealment that protects it, in which case the honesty that would dissolve it remains unspoken, or the honesty will eventually surface in a context of enough safety and courage that the shame loses the secrecy it needs to survive. The people who have moved through significant shame to genuine openness almost universally describe the disclosure not as a loss of protection, but as a release of a weight they had been carrying so long they had forgotten it was not a natural part of their body. The shame was the weight. The honesty was putting it down. Chapter 5. Honest Relationships and Why They Are Rare. Most relationships operate at a level of honesty that is considerably below what both people in the relationship are capable of, and in many cases, below what both secretly want. The conversations are warm. The care is genuine. The connection is real, at the level it operates. But there is more that is not said than is said. There are versions of what both people actually think that do not appear in the conversations they have. There are needs that are managed privately rather than voiced. There are disappointments that are absorbed without acknowledgement. There are truths that would change the relationship, perhaps for the better, that remain unspoken because both people have decided, usually without discussion, that the version of the relationship that maintains the comfort of the current equilibrium is preferable to the unknown version of the relationship that honesty might produce. This is not hypocrisy. It is not dishonesty in the moral sense. It is the very human management of risk in relationships, and it is nearly universal. People edit themselves in relationships because the experience of having something true rejected is among the most painful experiences available, and the relationship is one of the things that matters most, which means the stakes of honesty feel very high. The irony is that the editing, the management, The careful presentation of the acceptable version, rather than the actual version, is precisely what prevents the relationship from developing the depth that would make the risk of honesty feel lower. Depth in relationships comes from genuine knowing, and genuine knowing requires genuine disclosure. The editing prevents the depth, and the lack of depth justifies the editing, and the loop continues indefinitely. Research on relationship satisfaction and longevity consistently identifies what researchers call responsive honesty as a key differentiator in high-quality relationships. Responsive honesty is not the brutal delivery of every true thought without regard for the other person's experience. It is the combination of honesty and genuine care for how the honesty lands, the willingness to tell the truth and to do so in a way that communicates that the relationship matters to the person speaking. The honest person who delivers truth with no apparent regard for the other person is practicing a form of dominance dressed as honesty. The genuinely honest person in a relationship says what is true and communicates through how they say it. That the other person's experience of receiving it matters enormously. The moment of first genuine honesty in a relationship that has been operating on managed presentation is one of the most consequential moments available in human experience. Something shifts when it happens. The quality of the air in the conversation changes. The other person often responds not with the rejection that was feared, but with something closer to relief, because they too were managing something, and the first person's honesty gave them permission to stop. Not always. Some relationships cannot hold the weight of genuine honesty because they were built entirely on managed presentations, and the genuine selves never actually met. Those relationships change shape when honesty arrives, sometimes in the direction of greater depth, and sometimes in the direction of graceful and clear-eyed distance. Both outcomes are better than the indefinitely managed proximity that looked like connection but was not. Friendships that have depth are rare, partly because depth requires honesty, and honesty requires a certain kind of courage that many people do not know they have access to. The surface friendship, the one that functions well in pleasant conditions, is comfortable and genuinely valuable. But the friendship that can hold difficulty, that can survive one person saying something the other person did not want to hear, that can function as a space where both people can actually bring their real experience rather than their presentable experience, is a different order of relationship. It requires, from both people, the willingness to risk the relationship on the truth. Most people will not make that bet until they realize that the alternative, the friendship maintained entirely on pleasant surfaces, is already a kind of loss. Families are the original training ground for whether honesty is safe or dangerous, and the patterns established in families are the ones that most require deliberate examination in adult life. The family that handled disagreement through shutdown, through shaming, through punitive withdrawal of warmth, trained its members that honesty has severe social consequences. The family that handled difficult truths with curiosity and care, even imperfectly, trained its members that honesty is survivable and that relationships can hold genuine exchange. Most families did something in between, which means most people carry a complicated and inconsistent relationship with honesty in close relationships that requires sorting through rather than simply inheriting. Romantic relationships are the arena where the cost of managed honesty is most clearly visible over time. Research by relationship psychologist John Gottman identified what he called the 4 horsemen of relationship apocalypse: contempt, defensiveness, criticism, and stonewalling. Each of these patterns is, in different ways, the product of sustained dishonesty in the relationship, the accumulation of unspoken truths that eventually surface in destructive forms. The contempt that corrodes a relationship was often years of unexpressed hurt or disappointment that was never given language. The defensiveness that prevents repair was often the product of a relationship where honesty had not felt safe enough to be received with genuine openness. The patterns at the end of a struggling relationship are not the origin. They are the compounded interest on a debt of unexpressed truth that was never addressed when addressing it would have been possible. Building honest relationships does not require a dramatic confession or a single transformative conversation, though sometimes those things are necessary and real. It begins with smaller practices. The willingness to say, "I actually disagree with you about that in a moment," when going along would have been easier. The capacity to say, "I am not okay right now," when the easier answer would have been fine. The courage to ask the question you have been hesitant to ask because the answer might complicate things. These small acts of honesty, practiced in the relationships that matter, gradually establish a different kind of relational ground, one where both people know the other is capable of genuine presence, and where the trust that comes from that knowing makes the deeper honesty progressively less risky to practice. Chapter 6: Honesty at Work and Why It Changes Everything. Professional environments are perhaps the most elaborate systems human beings have ever designed for the suppression of genuine honesty. The social norms of most workplaces reward the performance of confidence, agreement, and alignment over the expression of doubt, dissent, and genuine difficulty. The person who says, "I am not sure about this direction," or "I think there is a significant problem with this plan," or "I made an error that needs to be addressed," is taking a social risk in most professional contexts that the person who performs certainty and agreement is not. The workplace, in its typical form, has been specifically engineered through its reward and consequence systems to select for managed presentation rather than for the kind of radical honesty that would make it function better. The cost of this engineering is visible in the phenomenon researchers call the spiral of silence, described by political scientist Elizabeth Noel Neumann, but deeply applicable to organizational contexts. In environments where honest dissent is implicitly or explicitly punished, people quickly learn to keep unpopular opinions private. The visible opinions in the room are not the actual opinions in the room. They are the opinions that feel safe to voice, given the perceived social consequences of expressing a contrary view. The result is a systematic distortion of the information available to decision-makers, who believe they are receiving the genuine assessment of their teams when they are actually receiving the carefully filtered version, edited for social acceptability. Decisions made on filtered information are decisions made on a false reality. Amy Edmondson's research on psychological safety in teams, referenced earlier in this book in the context of Google's Project Aristotle, produced a specific finding about what leaders do that creates or destroys the conditions for honest speech. Leaders who created psychologically safe environments shared several practices. They modeled vulnerability themselves, admitting what they did not know, and inviting honest pushback on their own thinking. They responded to honest speech from team members without punishment, even when the honest speech was critical or uncomfortable. They framed the work as genuinely uncertain rather than as already solved, which made curiosity and questioning feel appropriate rather than insubordinate. In short, the leaders who created safety were the leaders who practiced vulnerability themselves, and the teams responded by becoming honest in return. The specific form of honesty that is most missing in professional environments is the honest admission of failure, uncertainty, and not knowing. The professional culture in most organizations treats these as weaknesses to be managed rather than as realities to be engaged with, which means that problems that could be addressed early are surfaced late, that errors that could be corrected quickly are concealed until they are expensive, and that the collective intelligence of teams is severely underutilized because significant portions of what people actually know are never offered in spaces where managed competence is the currency. The workplace that rewards honesty about difficulty gets early warning of problems. The workplace that punishes it gets expensive surprises. Feedback, both giving and receiving it honestly, is one of the most practically significant applications of radical honesty in professional life, and it is almost universally handled poorly. The feedback most people give is so thoroughly softened by the desire to protect the relationship with the receiver that its actual content is largely lost. The feedback most people receive is filtered through defensiveness that prevents the content from reaching the level where it could actually change something. The result is an elaborate performance of development that produces very little actual development, because neither the honest assessment nor the genuine willingness to hear it is consistently present. Organizations spend enormous resources on feedback systems that do not work because they do not address the fundamental honesty problem at the center of why feedback fails. Courageous conversations, the direct discussions of difficult workplace realities that need to happen and consistently do not, are one of the highest leverage investments available in any professional environment. Research on organizational performance consistently shows that the avoided conversation, the one that everyone knows needs to happen, but that no one has been willing to initiate, is almost always the conversation that, if had, would produce the most movement on the issue everyone is working around. Teams know when they have a conflict that is being managed rather than addressed. They know when a leader's assessment of a situation does not match their own. They know when a project is not going well in ways that the official narrative has not yet acknowledged. Getting those conversations into the open, even imperfectly, moves things that the careful management of the situation cannot. The professional reputation that comes from being honestly known is different from the reputation that comes from the management of perception, and it is more durable. The person known for giving honest assessments, even when those assessments are not what people hoped to hear, becomes someone whose opinion is sought precisely because it can be trusted to be real. The person known for admitting what they do not know becomes someone who can be relied upon to also be honest about what they do know. The person who has demonstrated the courage to name a difficult truth when naming it mattered becomes someone to whom the difficult truths in the organization are more readily surfaced because people have learned that the telling will produce something useful rather than something punishing. Radical honesty in professional contexts is not naive or disregarding of political reality. It does not require saying everything you think to everyone, regardless of context and consequence. It requires knowing when the truth needs to be told and finding the courage and the skill to tell it in a way that it can be received. That combination of courage and skill is not common, which is why the people who develop it become disproportionately valuable in almost every professional environment they inhabit. They become the people organizations rely on when the comfortable fictions stop working, and someone is needed who can look at what is actually happening and say so out loud. Chapter 7: The Courage Muscle and How It Grows. Courage does not arrive fully formed. It is not a character trait some people are born with, and others are permanently without. The research on courage and its development is remarkably consistent on this point. Courage is a practice, a capacity that grows through use and atrophies through avoidance, much like a physical muscle. The person who avoids every situation requiring courage does not stay at the same level of courage indefinitely. They actually become less capable of it over time, because the avoidance reinforces the neural pathways associated with retreat and weakens the pathways associated with approach. The person who regularly practices small acts of courage in low-stakes contexts is genuinely building something that is available in higher-stakes contexts when it is needed. The mechanism by which courage develops through practice has been studied in the context of what psychologists call behavioral activation. When a person takes action towards something they are afraid of, especially when the feared outcome does not materialize or is survivable. When it does, the brain's threat assessment of that category of situation is updated. Not permanently and not completely, but measurably. The person who speaks up in a meeting when they had been silent before and discovers that the sky does not fall has experienced something that their nervous system processes as useful data. The threat level associated with speaking up in meetings adjusts slightly downward. The next time is slightly less difficult. The time after that, slightly less again. The courage was not always there, it was built. There is a concept in behavioral psychology called successive approximation that is relevant to the development of courage around honesty specifically. Successive approximation is the process of moving toward a target behavior through a sequence of steps, each of which is close to, but not identical to, the target, gradually shaping behavior toward the final goal through the reinforcement of each intermediate step. Applied to vulnerability and honest expression, this means that the path to being genuinely honest in the highest stakes situations of your life runs through being honest in progressively lower stakes situations first. The person who cannot yet be honest about a significant difficulty in their most important relationship can practice being honest about smaller things, building the pathway and building the evidence that honesty is survivable before arriving at the harder conversation. The physiological experience of courage is worth understanding because it tends to be confused with the absence of fear in a way that discourages people. Courage, in its actual experience, is the presence of fear alongside the decision to act anyway. The elevated heart rate, the dry mouth, the slight tremor in the voice, the temptation to find a reason to postpone the thing, these are not signals that courage is absent. They are the physical evidence that courage is being called upon. People who have practiced courage in various contexts consistently report that these physical signs do not disappear with experience. What changes is not the feeling, but the relationship to the feeling. The fear becomes familiar rather than catastrophic. The person recognizes it as the signature of a moment that matters, rather than as evidence that they should not proceed. One of the most reliable ways to build the courage muscle specifically around honest expression is through low-stakes practice of direct communication in ordinary situations. Saying what you actually think about a restaurant choice when your default would be to defer. Saying you disagree with an opinion in a casual conversation when your default would be to nod. Saying you do not know when asked something you do not know, instead of generating a plausible-sounding answer. Telling someone you appreciate something about them directly and specifically when your default would be to think it but not say it. These are not dramatic acts of vulnerability. They are small calibrations of your relationship with honest expression that accumulate into a practiced confidence that what is true can generally be said. The relationship between courage and self-trust is foundational in a way that is rarely named explicitly. The person who regularly acts with courage in the direction of honesty builds a kind of self-trust that is not available through any other means. It is not the self-trust that comes from always succeeding. It is the self-trust that comes from knowing that when difficult moments arise, you will not abandon yourself entirely, that you will find, some version of what is true and offer it, that you will show up even when showing up is frightening. This self-trust, built through small acts of courage, practiced consistently, becomes the foundation for larger acts of courage in the moments when they genuinely matter. The person who trusts themselves to be honest in small things is far better positioned to be honest in large ones. Setbacks in the practice of courage are not failures. They are data. The conversation where you went silent when you meant to speak. The moment where the managed version of yourself stepped in and the honest version stepped back. The feedback you gave that was so softened by the desire to protect the relationship that its actual content was lost. These are not evidence that courage is not available to you. They are the entirely predictable imperfections of a practice that is genuinely difficult, that goes against deeply established behavioral patterns, and that requires the ongoing negotiation of competing impulses every time it is called upon. The courage muscle does not build in a straight line. It builds through the accumulation of attempts, successful and otherwise, each of which adds something to the capacity, even when it does not feel like a triumph. The highest expression of the courage muscle in the context of radical honesty is not the single, dramatic moment of truth-telling that transforms a relationship or a situation, though those moments exist and matter. It is the person who has built enough consistent courage that honesty becomes their default orientation, who reaches for the true thing before the managed thing because the practice has made the true thing more available. The armor is not gone. The fear is not gone. The concern about how honesty will be received is not gone. What is gone is the automatic supremacy of those concerns over the genuine expression. The honest thing now competes with the managed thing on closer to equal footing. And that competition, genuinely opened, is where the most interesting parts of a person's life begin to happen. Chapter 8. When honesty hurts, and what to do with that. There is a version of honesty that is not radical in the liberating sense, but brutal in the damaging sense. It delivers truth without care for how the truth lands. It uses honesty as a weapon dressed in principle, saying, "I am just being honest," as a way of issuing criticism that does not have to be accountable for its impact, because the speaker has wrapped it in the moral authority of truthfulness. This is not the kind of honesty this book is about. But it is important to examine it directly, because the conflation of brutal honesty with radical honesty is one of the primary reasons people are rightly cautious about the practice. Understanding the difference is not an academic exercise. It is the practical skill that makes honesty a force for connection rather than a tool for damage. The research on how feedback and difficult truths can be delivered in ways that are both honest and constructive points to several factors that matter enormously. The relationship context in which the honesty is offered shapes how it is received more than almost any characteristic of the content itself. The same difficult truth delivered in a relationship where the person trusts that they are cared for is experienced very differently than the same truth delivered in a relationship where that trust has not been established. The physical and emotional state of the person receiving the honesty, the timing of the delivery, the specificity of the content rather than global judgments about the person, and the presence or absence of acknowledgement of the person's experience alongside the honest assessment. All of these modulate whether the honesty is received as useful or as an attack. Honesty that hurts can be necessary, and it can be delivered with genuine care. These are not mutually exclusive. The doctor who tells a patient that their lifestyle is producing serious health risks is delivering honesty that hurts and is doing so out of genuine care for the patient's well-being. The friend who tells another friend that a pattern of behavior is damaging their relationship is delivering honesty that hurts and is doing so because the friendship is worth telling the truth in. The manager who tells an employee that the quality of their work is not meeting the standard required is delivering honesty that hurts and is doing so in service of the employee's development and the team's effectiveness. In each case, the pain of the honesty is not evidence that the honesty should not have been offered. It is the temporary cost of the genuine information being transferred. The difference between honesty that hurts and honesty that damages is not always in the content. It is often in the delivery, the timing, the relationship, and the intention. Honesty that is delivered at a moment of maximum vulnerability in the other person, that is offered globally rather than specifically, that has no evident care for the other person's experience within the delivery, that is used to win an argument rather than to genuinely help, or that comes from a place of contempt rather than care, is honesty in the technical sense, but something close to cruelty in the practical sense. The person who practices radical honesty must develop the discernment to ask, before speaking, whether this truth is being offered in service of the other person and the relationship, or whether it is being offered in service of their own need to be right, to punish, or to feel morally superior. Receiving honesty that hurts is its own skill, and one that is rarely taught. The defensive response to difficult, honest feedback is so neurologically automatic that most people have never even considered that there might be an alternative. The threat response activates. The self-protective narrative begins. The evaluation of the source begins. Looking for reasons, the honest assessment is not credible. The counter-argument assembles itself. All of this happens before the person has even fully processed what was actually said. The defensive response is not dishonest in itself. It is the nervous system doing what nervous systems do when something threatening is incoming. The skill is in what happens next, in whether the person can, after the initial defensive response, return to the content with enough openness to ask whether anything in it is true and useful. There is a practice from the Buddhist tradition, adapted widely in therapeutic and coaching contexts, called beginner's mind. The practice of approaching a situation with the openness and lack of preconception of someone who is encountering it for the first time. Applied to receiving difficult honesty, beginner's mind means approaching the feedback as if it might contain something genuinely useful rather than as a situation to be survived and defended against. It does not require agreeing with everything said. It requires genuine openness to the possibility that the person offering the honest assessment might be seeing something real. That openness is not the same as surrender. It is the precondition for actually receiving anything other than the echo of your own existing belief about yourself. The aftermath of an honest exchange that was painful, whether the pain came from giving honest feedback, receiving it, or both, is often a period that determines whether the honesty ultimately served the relationship or damaged it. What happens in the hours and days after a difficult, honest conversation is shaped by whether both people can return to the care and commitment that motivated the honesty in the first place, or whether the pain of the exchange hardens into resentment or distance. Relationships that can move through genuinely painful, honest exchanges and emerge with the relationship intact, and often with greater depth than before, have developed a quality of robustness that is only available through having done exactly what they just did. The pain was the price of the depth. Most people who have paid it at least once do not regret it. The single most useful thing to hold when honesty hurts, whether you are the one who offered it or the one who received it, is the understanding that genuine care and genuine pain can coexist in the same moment. The friend who tells you a difficult truth loves you. The employee who raises a problem with your leadership approach respects you enough to believe you can hear it. The partner who names what has not been working in the relationship values the relationship enough to try to make it better rather than simply endure it. The pain and the care are not contradictions. They are the specific combination that genuine honesty in genuine relationship almost always produces, and the relationship strong enough to hold both is stronger than the relationship where the care was protected by silence. Chapter 9. Discernment, knowing when and with whom. Radical honesty is not the same as indiscriminate disclosure. This distinction cannot be made too strongly or returned to too often, because the misunderstanding of it is what sends people to one of two equally unhelpful extremes. Either they practice the armor that this book is about dismantling, or they overcorrect into an unfiltered expression that treats every thought and feeling as equally appropriate to share with every person in every context, which is not honesty, but its own kind of disorder. The practice being described in this book is discerning honesty, the kind that has developed the wisdom to know not just what is true, but who deserves to receive it when the moment is right for it, and in what form it will be most useful to offer. Trust is the primary filter for appropriate honesty, and it is earned, not assumed. The people who deserve your most genuine honesty are the people who have demonstrated, through their responses to smaller revelations over time, that they can hold what you give them without using it against you. Brené Brown describes this with an image. The people who deserve your vulnerability are the people who have earned the right to hear your story. Not everyone in your life has done that work. Not everyone in your life is capable of doing it. And the appropriate response to that reality is not to withhold honesty from everyone, but to calibrate honesty to the trust that has been built in each specific relationship. Context determines what honesty is appropriate with a specificity that general advice about openness cannot capture. The professional context in which your candid assessment of a situation will be evaluated for political implications before it is evaluated for accuracy requires a different calibration than the long-standing friendship where both people have established the norm of saying what they actually think. The early stages of a relationship where trust is still forming and the other person does not yet have enough context to receive your full complexity accurately require different calibration than the relationship of years where you have been genuinely known and have survived many honest exchanges. Learning to read context for what level of honesty it can receive is the specific skill that distinguishes the person who practices radical honesty wisely from the person who simply says everything they think. Timing is a dimension of discernment that most people underestimate even when they understand the principle. The honest conversation that needed to happen in a moment of calm becomes destructive in a moment of acute stress. The feedback that would have been productive before a high-stakes event becomes unhelpful when delivered immediately before it, when the person has no space to integrate it and must perform regardless. The difficult truth that can be heard when a person feels generally secure in a relationship lands very differently when the person already feels uncertain about that relationship. Reading the emotional temperature of the moment, the person, and the relationship before choosing to introduce something difficult is not avoidance. It is the intelligent deployment of honesty in conditions that maximize the chance it will be received as intended. The difference between what you are thinking and what needs to be said is a distinction that requires ongoing and honest self-examination. Not every thought deserves expression. Not every feeling requires externalization. The internal experience of judgment, irritation, envy, or criticism is not automatically appropriate material for honest expression just because it is genuinely felt. The practice of radical honesty is about bringing more of your authentic self into genuine contact with the world and the people in it, not about providing a running transcript of every internal state. The question worth asking before expressing something is whether sharing this serves the other person, the relationship, or a genuine value, or whether it primarily serves the desire to be known at low cost, to unburden oneself at someone else's expense, or to produce an impression of openness without genuine vulnerability. The specific areas of life that most benefit from greater honesty are worth identifying personally because the generic advice to be more open is less useful than the specific identification of where your particular pattern of concealment is costing you most. For some people, it is the avoidance of conflict that prevents honest expression in close relationships. For others, it is the professional self-management that keeps their genuine assessment of situations from ever entering the room. For others, it is the performance of fine when they are not fine that prevents people who want to support them from knowing that support is needed. For others, it is the creative self-concealment that keeps the genuine work from ever being made, because the honest expression of one's actual perspective feels too exposing. The place where your particular brand of managed presentation is costing you most is the place where the practice of discerning honesty will return most. Some relationships and contexts genuinely do not deserve more honesty than they are currently receiving, and recognizing this is as important as recognizing where more honesty is needed. The colleague who has demonstrated that they will use sensitive information politically does not need to receive your genuine assessment of a situation. The acquaintance in a context where vulnerability would be out of place does not need your difficult personal truths. The public context where honest expression carries professional or social consequences that are genuinely disproportionate to the benefit of the expression may require strategic reserve rather than immediate honesty. Discernment is not rationalization for indefinite withholding. It is the honest application of wisdom to when, where, how, and with whom. The development of discernment happens alongside the development of honesty, not before it. People who are waiting until they have perfect discernment before practicing any vulnerability will wait forever, because discernment about what honesty is appropriate is itself something that develops through the practice and experience of being honest in various contexts. You learn what feels right to share and what does not. Through the actual experience of sharing and observing the results, you develop the calibration through the doing of it. The person who waits for the knowledge to precede the practice has misunderstood how the knowledge is actually acquired. Practice first, imperfectly, and with whatever discernment is currently available. The discernment grows from there. Chapter 10. Honest Creativity and the Work That Only You Can Make. Every creative act is an act of self-disclosure, not always intentionally, not always consciously, but something of the person making the thing is always in the thing being made, and the degree to which that something is genuine, rather than managed, determines, to a significant extent, whether the work has the quality that makes it resonate with other people in the way that only genuine work can. The craft matters. The technical skill matters. But the work that finds its way most deeply into others is almost always the work where the person making it was honest enough to put something genuinely real into it, something that came from the actual interior of their experience rather than from their idea of what a person like them should be making. The history of art, literature, music, and creative expression across all forms is a history of people who found the courage to be honest about their actual experience and who discovered, often to their own surprise, that the honesty was precisely what made the work connect. The memoir writer who could not find the courage to tell the true story of what happened settled for a safer, less exact version that was technically well crafted and entirely forgettable. The songwriter who wrote from the most specific and personally embarrassing detail of a relationship, found that the specificity was what made strangers recognize themselves in it. The entrepreneur whose pitch finally connected with investors was not the one that described the product in abstract terms, but the one where the founder was honest about the problem they had personally experienced and the genuine frustration that drove them to build the solution. Psychologist and creativity researcher Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying the conditions under which people do their most creative and meaningful work. His research on what he called flow, the state of optimal experience in creative and challenging tasks, identified several conditions that reliably produce it. Among them was the condition of working on something that genuinely matters to the person working on it, something that connects to their authentic concerns and interests, rather than to external expectations about what they should be making. The dishonest creative choice, the one made in service of anticipated approval, rather than genuine expression, reliably produces work that feels thin to the person making it, and often registers as thin to audiences too, because the quality of genuine investment is detectable even when it cannot be articulated. The specific form of creative dishonesty that costs the most is the preemptive self-censorship that happens before the work is even made. The writer who imagines what critics will say before they have written a word and adjusts the work in response to the imagined criticism. The designer who considers what the client is likely to prefer before they have explored what they genuinely see. The musician who gravitates towards the genre that is commercially viable, rather than the music that is actually asking to be made. In each case, the work begins from a managed position rather than an honest one, and the work carries the evidence of that management in its own texture, a smoothness where roughness would have been real, a predictability where the surprising, genuine thing might have been. The fear of the specific is one of the primary forms of creative dishonesty that keeps work from reaching its potential. The general truth feels safer than the specific one, because the general truth has more people in it and therefore more people to hide among. But the specific truth, the particular and unrepeatable detail of an actual experience, is what makes work feel real to someone who was not there. The story that says a character felt sad is a general truth. The story that says the character noticed they had eaten the same cereal every morning for 9 years and suddenly could not open the box is a specific truth, strange and particular, that produces recognition in readers who have never eaten that cereal and may never have experienced that kind of grief. Specificity is the evidence of genuine, honest looking. And genuine, honest looking is what makes work matter. Perfectionism and creative honesty are in direct conflict for a reason that goes beyond the mechanics of revision and release. Perfectionism in creative work is almost always a form of self-protection that keeps the genuinely personal element of the work at arm's length. If the work is perfect enough, it can be presented as the work of craft rather than the work of genuine self-expression, and the person making it can maintain some distance from the exposure of having made something real. But the genuine self-expression is exactly what gives the work its power. The perfectionism that prevents release is often, at its deepest level, the fear of being genuinely seen through the thing you made. And the antidote is not better craft, but greater courage, about allowing the thing to be what it actually is. The creative work that only you can make is not the work that only you have the technical skill to produce. Many people have equivalent or greater technical skill. It is the work that only you have the particular combination of experience, perspective, and honest observation to produce, because it comes from the specific and unrepeatable interior of your particular life. The most powerful creative work tends to emerge not from people who found the most impressive technical approach, but from people who were honest enough to look at what was actually in their experience and courageous enough to put it in the work, without so heavily managing it that the genuine thing was diluted past recognition. The technical skill serves the honest content. The honest content is not replaced by technical skill. Building a creative practice that is genuinely honest requires the same graduated approach described in the chapter on courage. Not beginning with the most exposing work and demanding that you release it before trust in the practice has been established. Beginning with the small, honest choice in the lower stakes creative decision. The sentence that says what you actually mean rather than what sounds most polished. The design choice that reflects your genuine aesthetic rather than the predicted preference of the audience. The creative direction that excites you rather than the one that feels most defensible. Each small, honest choice in creative work builds the evidence that honesty in making is survivable, and that evidence accumulates into the capacity for the genuinely exposing work that has the most power to matter. Chapter 11, The Honest Body, What You Say Without Words. There is a channel of communication that is always operating, always broadcasting, always receiving, and that most people have never deliberately examined or developed. It is the body, the posture, the breath, the quality of eye contact, the pace of movement, the tension or ease in the hands, the way the head tilts or the shoulders hold. All of this is communicating continuously, and what it is communicating is often something quite different from the words being offered. The managed person says, "I am fine," while every physical signal in their body announces that they are not. The armored person says, "I am open," while their body remains closed, in posture, in breath, in the way they hold the space between themselves and other people. The body does not lie as easily as the mouth does, and people who are skilled at reading it know far more about what is actually happening than the spoken performance intends to reveal. Research on nonverbal communication confirms what observant people have always known intuitively. Albert Mehrabian's often cited research suggested that in emotional communication, the vast majority of meaning is carried through nonverbal channels rather than through the content of words. While subsequent research has complicated and qualified his specific numbers, the directional finding remains robust. How something is communicated, the physical and vocal qualities of the delivery, carries enormous weight in how it is received. The person who says, "I appreciate your feedback," while their body registers contempt, is not delivering gratitude. They are delivering contempt with a verbal apology attached, and the person receiving it experiences the contempt regardless of the words. The authentic alignment between the body and the words, what researchers call congruence, is one of the primary signals of genuine honesty that people register without being able to articulate it explicitly. When what is said and how it is said are congruent with what the body is doing, the whole communication registers as real. When they are not congruent, the perception of inauthenticity arises even in people who cannot explain where it is coming from. This is why the most skilled manipulators in the world work on their non-verbal expression alongside their verbal content. And it is also why the most genuinely trustworthy people in your life are those whose body and words tell the same story, because that consistency is felt as a kind of safety. The body also communicates the person's relationship to what they are saying at the level of self-disclosure. The person who shares something genuinely personal and uncertain while their body stays open, their breath stays even, their eye contact remains steady, is communicating something different from the person who shares the same content, while their body tightens. Their gaze slides away, their breath shallows out. The first person is in genuine contact with what they are sharing. The second person is performing the disclosure while simultaneously retreating from it, and the audience receives both messages. This is one of the ways the body reveals the difference between genuine vulnerability and the performance of it. Breathing is the physical practice most directly connected to the quality of honest communication, because it is both a reflection of the internal state and a regulator of it. The person who is about to say something genuinely honest, something that matters and that carries uncertainty about how it will be received, will often notice a slight change in their breathing pattern, a catch, a shallowing, the automatic prelude of the stress response. Attending to that breath, taking one deliberate full breath before speaking, is not a trick for appearing calm. It is an actual modulation of the nervous system that changes the physiological conditions in which the honest speech will be offered. The calm breath before the honest word is itself an act of preparation that makes the honest word more available. The relationship between physical self-awareness and emotional honesty is more direct than most people realize. People who have developed a rich vocabulary for their own physical states, who can notice and name what is happening in their body with specificity, tend to also have greater access to their emotional experience and greater ability to communicate it accurately. The person who can feel the tightening in their chest that accompanies a specific kind of anxiety can name that anxiety more precisely than the person who only knows they feel bad. The person who can notice the physical quality of excitement in their body can distinguish it from the physical quality of anxiety, which feel similar and are often confused. Physical self-awareness is the foundation of emotional accuracy, and emotional accuracy is the foundation of honest communication. The body also holds the history of suppression in ways that affect present communication. Years of managing emotional expression leave their record in chronic muscular tension patterns, in altered breathing habits, in the habitual narrowing of physical self-expression that becomes the resting state of the armored person. Research on somatic experience, developed by clinicians working with trauma and emotional suppression, suggests that this physical history needs physical engagement, not just cognitive understanding, to genuinely shift. The person who wants to become more genuinely expressive and honest may need to work with the body's stored patterns of holding as much as with the mind's stored patterns of belief. The body remembers what the mind wants to change, and inviting the body into the process of change is not optional. It is how the change becomes whole. Developing an honest body is the practice of bringing the physical expression of yourself into alignment with your actual experience, neither performing more than is felt, nor suppressing what is genuinely present. This does not mean emotional exhibitionism or the absence of appropriate professional composure. It means that the person inside the body and the body the world sees are in genuine contact with each other, that the breath and the posture and the gaze are responding to the real situation rather than maintaining a managed presentation of it. The person whose body and words align is not vulnerable in a naive sense. They are honest in the deepest sense, present in a way that others feel and trust, and are drawn to in ways that the managed, performed version of the same person never quite achieves. Chapter 12. The person you become when you stop hiding. There is a version of you that has been waiting, not patiently, not in stillness, but in the accumulated pressure of unexpressed truth and unrisked connection and unshared creative work and unmade difficult conversations. That version has been waiting not for the right conditions, not for the perfect moment of safety, not for the guarantee that honesty will be received the way it deserves to be received. It has been waiting for the decision to stop treating your own inner life as primarily a liability to be managed and to start treating it as the most valuable thing you have to bring to the world. That decision is not a single moment. It is a direction, and directions chosen and maintained through all the days that test them eventually produce a destination that looks nothing like where you started. What changes first when the hiding decreases is the quality of energy available for everything else. The maintenance of the managed presentation is metabolically expensive, as described in the opening chapter. When that maintenance begins to ease, even partially, the energy it was consuming becomes available for other things, for the work that genuinely matters, for the relationships that deserve full presence, for the creative pursuits that require genuine investment. People who have moved significantly in the direction of radical honesty often describe a surprising increase in their capacity for engagement, not because their circumstances changed, but because the energy that was fueling the performance has been redirected toward the actual life. The relationships that form and deepen around genuine honesty have a different quality from the relationships that were built on managed presentation. The connection is deeper, not because more dramatic things have been shared, but because what has been shared is real. There is less work required to maintain them, because there is less performance required in them. The other person knows something genuine about you, and you know something genuine about them, and the relationship rests on that mutual knowing rather than on the mutual maintenance of acceptable images. These relationships tend to be fewer in number, but dramatically greater in quality. And the person who has some of them knows immediately the difference between their weight and the weight of the many pleasant surface connections that preceded them. The professional life of a person who practices radical honesty looks different in ways that are sometimes surprising. They are not universally loved because genuine honesty sometimes produces friction that managed agreeableness does not. But they are almost always genuinely respected because the quality of their assessments can be trusted, because people know where they stand with them, because their word means something that the words of managed people do not quite mean. They are sought for the difficult conversations because they can be relied on to have them. They are trusted with the significant work because their judgment has not been observed to be in service of their own image. The professional life built on genuine honesty is not necessarily smoother. It is more real, and it accumulates into something more solid. The creative life that becomes possible when honesty is the foundation has a specific quality of aliveness that the managed creative life does not. The work that comes from genuine, honest engagement with the actual material of your experience has a texture that distinguishes it from work produced from a safer, more managed place. Other people feel it in the work before they can name what they are feeling. There is something in genuinely honest creative work that the audience recognizes as akin to their own experience, even when the surface content is very different from anything they have lived, because the honesty is not in the content, but in the quality of looking. And people respond to genuine looking with something very close to gratitude, because it is rare and because it gives them permission to look at themselves with the same quality of honesty. The internal experience of becoming someone who stops hiding is not primarily a story of increasing comfort. It is a story of increasing realness, which means that some things that were comfortable become less so, because the honest engagement with them reveals that they were comfortable through the suppression of something that now needs to be acknowledged. Some relationships that were manageable in their managed form become more complicated in their honest form, which is ultimately a healthier kind of complication. Some aspects of the life that felt acceptable through the low-resolution view of managed existence become less acceptable when seen clearly, which is painful and necessary, and ultimately a service. The increasing realness is not uniformly pleasant, but it is uniformly more alive than what it replaced. The person who has moved substantially in the direction of radical honesty does not become someone without protection or without wisdom about what to share and when. They become someone whose protection comes from inside rather than from a performance maintained outside. Their confidence doesn't rest on the approval of the people who only know the managed version. It rests on the relationship with themselves that genuine honesty builds. The self-knowledge and self-trust and self-respect that come from consistently choosing to bring something real into the world rather than something safe. That confidence is not dependent on any external confirmation. It is built from the inside and maintained from the inside, and it is ultimately exactly what armor was always trying to produce and never quite could. The journey toward radical honesty does not have an arrival point where the work is complete. The practice is ongoing because the situations that call for it are ongoing, because the pull toward managed presentation never fully disappears, because the world will continue to provide plenty of environments that reward the performance over the reality. The question is not whether you will always be perfectly honest in every situation. You will not. The question is whether you will keep moving in the direction of honesty. Keep choosing the real thing over the safe thing in the moments when you notice you have a choice. Keep building the courage muscle through small, consistent acts of genuine expression. And keep trusting that the version of yourself that shows up honestly in the world, imperfect and uncertain and real, is not a liability to be managed, but a person worth knowing.